Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast where we dive into the heart of the challenges of the energy future and talk about how the oil and gas industry will lead. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. In season 8, we're at a pivotal time, a time I'm calling the moment. Forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple and quick energy transition. So this season, I want to focus on why the oil and gas industry can seize this moment by providing proactive, positive engagement to political and civic leaders faced with the challenges ahead. So today's show, I speak with Scott Hallam, President and CEO at Boardwalk Pipelines. I wanted to talk to him, as you'll see, because he has this on-the-ground industry experience, but also he looks at things from different angles and he finds novel approaches. And I always find his point of view refreshing and interesting. And I think you will too. You can learn more about Scott Hallam's biography in our show notes. If you like what you're hearing, I hope you will check out my weekly email newsletter. Both of these things are true. You can learn more at the energythinks.com website. I think you're going to really enjoy the conversation I had with Scott and some of our meanderings around how to de-escalate the polarization by focusing on the future. Now, here's my conversation with Scott Hallam. Scott Hallam, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Tisha. I'm thrilled to be here today.
I wanted you to be the first guest of the season because I always enjoy talking to you. And you always have a different way of looking at things. So that's what we'll spend our time on today. But before we jump into that, I want to make sure that our audience gets to know you a little bit. Congratulations on your new role at the helm of Boardwalk. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about your career path before Boardwalk and if you'd like, a little bit about what you'd like to accomplish now that you're CEO?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me today. It's an opportunity to be out here and talk to you about topics that you discuss. So I've been in the industry for 25 years. It's gone by really, really fast. I've had an opportunity to work upstream, midstream, and downstream. But just a little something that many people don't know, maybe you don't even know, but my first job out of college in the 90s was actually doing air dispersion modeling and emission calculations.
Oh my God, you're a real nerd, Scott. I had a sneaking suspicion, but now I know, now it's confirmed.
But who would have thought, a kid coming out of college doing environmental work would be a CEO of an energy company 25 to 30 years later, and that those skills were actually relevant. I sometimes just it surprises me that the irony of that. So it's been a lot of fun watching and participating in this career. I've had an opportunity to work for production companies. I've had an opportunity to work for local distribution companies and downstream LNG. I've been an operations supervisor, had a chance to develop gathering and processing assets in the Utica and the Marcellus. But the most fun I've had and why I'm here at Boardwalk is I really love the transmission and storage space in natural gas. I think what we do is really interesting. We get to touch the supply markets. We get to serve the downstream market. So it's been a lot of fun. I'm excited to be here at Boardwalk. It's a great company. I've been here since September of last year, and I continue to be impressed with the people, the assets, the customers that we serve. The culture here has just been really, really incredible. So I'm having a lot of fun.
I'm glad you're there too, and I totally get why you love transmission, because transmission is the literal lifeblood of our economy, right? Like, you move the fuels that allow everything to be possible, which I think is so, I always imagine it as like the veins and arteries of our economy. And I love that. I also am interested, I did not know that you were in air dispersion modeling. So that's kind of interesting, but it's cool because we do have a fair number of energy college students that listen to our podcast, because we are regularly making the case that if climate is a priority, working in the energy industry is one of the most important places to be. And so you're living proof of that. Before we, like, environmentalism was like barely even a thing in the 90s in the industry. And now it's so central that you're the CEO. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And one of the exciting parts is there's so many ways for us to continue to improve our emissions reductions. And, just having the background that I do and working with people that have been working in this space for decades, we're really being able to drive value out of areas of the business that hasn't traditionally been seen as part of the value proposition, really being part of just the cost of operating. And that's really how I came into the industry. It was just, you had to run your emission calculations, your performance testing, your air dispersion modeling to comply with the Title V permit or a PSD permit. Well, today it's a totally different equation. People that are doing those tasks are finding ways for us to drive our emissions down, which is having a huge value impact and proposition to individual companies and our industry.
Well, it's cool. And we'll pull on this thread a little bit as we talk about this idea of the moment, which I want to get your take on it. And I'll make sure we circle back in our conversation today to this idea of climate action or emissions reduction action as central to competitive advantage, right? Central to being successful as a business. But let me set up the idea of the moment, because it is the first episode of the season, and the whole season we're going to focus on this idea of the moment. And that's, I believe we're at a time where civic leaders, policymakers, policy leaders have to be thinking about the energy transition differently. Suddenly, there's this really clear increase in demand for power from things like AI. There are early movers who are running into challenges. Like, this isn't easy. It turns out like transforming the entire energy system isn't easy, also while you're trying to grow it. And I think that creates an opportunity for our industry. And that opportunity is really around engaging with solutions, engaging with these civic leaders to say, yeah, wow, this looks like it's going to be really challenging. How can we step into it? But let me first get your take on just the general premise. Do you see these forces at play? Do you see a moment emerging where we can talk and think about, as a society, the energy transition or the energy evolution differently?
Well, let's kind of step through it one step at a time. First, I would say there are definitely conflicting forces, and that's a pretty obvious statement, but I think it's important to recognize that there are conflicting forces at work. The desire for weather-dependent energy generation resources, it's a challenge when we think about extreme weather events and whether or not that those will drive the same reliability as power derived from natural gas. So there are conflicting forces that's challenging our reliability, challenging cost. If you just look at the cost of power across the country, there's a really interesting dichotomy that's starting to form. And you can see cost in a kilowatt hour basis. In some parts of the country, that's less than 10 cents. In other parts of the country, it's over 25 cents per kilowatt hour. And it just tells you that there is a difference when there's this rapid, simplistic adoption of energy transition philosophies and weather-dependent resources being used instead of, all forms of energy, that's certainly having impact on reliability. It's having an impact on affordability. So I would say that's point number one, and there's a lot to unpack from that perspective. But I think another perspective that doesn't get addressed enough and doesn't get recognized enough is that I would say over the last 8 to 10 years, if you look at a traditional energy company, whether it's a producer, it's a midstream company like Boardwalk, it's a local distribution company, our businesses have metamorphosized. We've gone from a very traditional mindset where characteristics of what I opened up with around, frontline environmental employees really doing things just to drive the ability to operate. And we have evolved into those areas and many more being areas of value generation to the businesses. And so I would give a lot of credit to the challenges that my industry has faced over the last 8 to 10 years. and in terms of maturing and bringing us forward and advancing our social conscience and the responsibilities that we have in order to be a legitimate operator in this day and age, and what society expects from us. And so I think that there's a really interesting study and conversation to be had around where we were, where we are today, and where we think we can go in the future. And I think there's more ground to be gained when we think about how all aspects of our business can continue to evolve and advance, in the heading of driving more value to our businesses, our shareholders, and stakeholders. We can do what we do better. And I think that is kind of the lurking opportunity with the moment that you're talking about, is that it's on us in the energy space to find ways to continue to evolve and bring the conversation together with those that have traditionally been, our opposition, in finding the right solutions that can drive energy, reliability, affordability, and really driving, our carbon footprint down simultaneously.
There's a lot of interesting ideas in there. I hadn't given thought before to this idea of, I've been thinking about external forces, right? There's these external forces pressing on this sort of us versus them climate conversation. I hadn't thought about yet until you said it, this idea that there is its own force of how the industry has evolved into this moment as well. And you said two things that I find really interesting. I want to make sure I got it right. So I'm just pushing on it and then you can let me know. One is that the industry has just evolved, right? Like the people, the societal expectations, people live and work in the communities or they operate, and they just want to be a part of the future, be a part of doing things better. So there's that component, but then there's also the component that it's just good business. Like there is money to be made, there's success to be had, there is innovation to be capitalized upon, because you can't stand still if you want to be a successful business. You have to be evolving. I hadn't really thought about that. I'd been thinking about like, oh, the world is figuring out this is hard and we should step in and help. But what you're really saying is like everyone is evolving, everything is evolving, and we are actually primed for this moment. Is that, what do you think? What do you think about all that?
No, I think you hit it spot on. One that's always in the front of my mind is how we attract young talent into our industry. And if I'm being honest, 20 years ago, I think our industry believed we were a great place to employ people. People will come and work in our space. And I would say probably not that long ago, we started to awaken to the reality that we have to attract and we have to retain talent, because our young talent is listening to what's being said societally. And I think we've gotten better, and we're continuing to get better at legitimizing what we do and why people should be excited and thrilled to work in the energy space. And so I think you look at an energy company today, there's a lot more resources and focus around how do we attract and retain talent. And those conversations and those thoughts and those resources weren't being allocated the same way 20 years ago as they are today.
It's such a central point. If you're in college and you want to work in the oil and gas industry, you can expect people in your life, even well-meaning legacy oil and gas employees, to say, is there going to be a job there in 10 years? Is there going to be a job there in 20 years? You can expect that because of this societal conversation. So I think even my own kids, they know exactly what I do. They used to have, I'm a fracker water bottle at high school, and they still will say, well, Mom, should I still go into oil and gas? So I think you're absolutely right. There is a burden on industry that I think we're rising to. I think we have risen to, and we continue to rise to, which is to say the ways in which we will create the future, the ways in which we are the future and will create the future.
And if I could have the last word on this point, I would say the sustainability reports that many of our companies are putting out, there's a sense of these are the things we've always been doing. Mm-hmm. And that is a true and accurate statement. But as an industry and as companies, we haven't always been really good at understanding how to tell that story. And today, with the expectation that if you're in the energy space, you need to tell your sustainability story. You need to tell the story of how you're addressing the environmental footprint of your business, how you're addressing societal pressures around your business. What governance do you have in place? And telling that very broad story, I think, is an example of where we are today. I don't think that anything stands still. Things will continue to evolve. But I think the value and the need for telling our sustainability story will continue on into the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the more it becomes material and central to business success, the better, right? The more it's not an add-on, it's not a tack on to the end, like we're running our business, PS, sustainability. The more that it's central in the way you're saying to value creation, I think makes a really good point. Let me ask you, back to this idea of the forces in your recent work. Do you see these forces at play? Do you see political leaders or communities starting to want to think and have different kinds of pragmatic conversations around the energy future? Like, what does this look like in your work?
First, yes, I think everyone is trying to work around having secure, reliable, affordable, and low carbon energy. In the transmission space, I see it, and probably nothing more obvious than in the regional transmission operator environment, RTOs like MISO, that's the midcontinent independent system operator, or PJM, and other regional transmission operators that have an obligation to ensure that the lights turn on when you flip the switch. And they certainly feel the pressure. Public utility commissions feel the pressure of the energy transition and the need for reliable and secure energy. And then I would round it out with utility companies. All three of them really feel the accountability around reliability and acknowledging in varying degrees across that three group spectrum, accountability around decarbonization and the importance of it, but struggling at times with how to balance reliability, affordability, and decarbonization. And so, yeah, I see very interesting dialogues taking place depending on where you are in the country. Mm-hmm. And I would bring up midcontinent independent system operator, MISO for short, as an example. They recently, in February of this year, published a reliability report. It's a response to reliability issues that we've seen through Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott. Not so much about Jerry and Heather, the two winter storms this last year, but talking about the imperative to have reliable energy. And that they don't use the term moment, but they certainly talk about it in terms of we are accelerating into a point in time where energy reliability is going to become more and more challenging to uphold. And so they're working through the thought processes of how do we ensure we have the right balance in our portfolio of energy generation that we can achieve those three things: reliability, affordability, and decarbonization. And I think they have some really interesting approaches. One is an accreditation of generation resources. So how do you accredit the value of a coal plant? How do you accredit the value to a solar panel or windmill? How do you accredit the value to a combined cycle natural gas electric generation plant? And so I don't want to take a lot of time getting into it, but I do want to respond that I do see that tension. I see the forces at work, and I really see organizations and people trying to get to the right balanced outcome. And I think we're still working through that dialogue. And I don't know that the moment has shown up yet, but we're standing ready to respond.
I think you make a great point, and we will link to that MISO report in the show notes, because up until pretty recently, I thought that affordability and cost was going to be the pivot point around which, when will the soccer moms revolt? It's going to be around cost. But actually, we had a proactive, just where I live, proactive power turn off for fire prevention for 3 days in the spring. And the community melted down. I mean, just melted down. And we didn't need heat or cooling. It was in the shoulder season. It wasn't life threatening. But this issue you raise around reliability echoes our last guest in the previous season, talked about we can't be turning resources off before we turn on new resources. And there's this, and that's part of what's, as you said, like the impending moment, this pressure that we can anticipate coming, I think is really important. So I'm glad you raised it. And I think it's wise the way that you're talking about it in careful terms, right? It's not like we told you so, or like the sky is falling. It's like, hey, we see it, we're anticipating, and we stand ready to be a partner, to be a leader. And so let me ask you a little bit about that. There are very well-meaning industry supporters that want to use these moments to double down on oil and gas, right? Like we just want the world to come back to us and love us for who we have been and the very many real contributions we've made to making this country and this world great. And I'm interested in how you think about those tensions, that sort of like fight or, response of the industry versus this opportunity for leadership. How are you navigating that? Because I think both of these things are true. And everyone is well-meaning, well-intentioned, but some are more effective than others. So how do you think about that tension?
Before I go there, let me go back to the last question, because I think it feeds into this question. And that is, I think when we're working through the tension and the forces, I think there's an understanding that natural gas and pipelines are a crucial part of that conversation. United States is blessed with probably the best natural gas grid. We have about 2.6 million miles of natural gas pipelines. About 300,000 miles are in interstate natural gas pipeline service. The rest is in local distribution company pipelines and intrastate pipelines, this and that. But what I would say is, when you look at the emissions reductions that have occurred as a result of the use of pipelines and the use of natural gas, it's astounding. We have seen almost 60% greenhouse gas or CO2e emission reductions since 2005 as a result of using more natural gas for generating electricity than we have in our past. And so I think there's a fact or a set of facts there that say that interstate pipelines, natural gas, and natural gas electric generation is part of the solution that we all have to recognize. And so I think that's a really important part. That being said, in the question you just asked, how do we address kind of the tired sense of the market will come back to us? The market's not coming back to where we were 20 years ago. It's not coming back to where we were 10 years ago. We have to acknowledge that the evolution will not revert back. We're going to continue to move forward. And I would go back to my earlier point. Our industry is better for it. We are keeping more methane in our pipes, whether it be flow lines from production wells and gathering systems, whether it be in the interstate natural gas systems, whether it be in underground storage. Today, we are operating our pipeline systems better than we ever have. And we're keeping that product in the pipeline better than we ever have. And we're not going to go backwards on that. So I really think that there is a moment that is ahead of us, and there's an opportunity for discussion. I don't really think it's a question of, are we going to go back? It's a question of, are we asking the right questions? And as I was thinking about this interview, I was thinking about my favorite movie. The movie is called Moneyball. And it's about the Oakland A's, and Billy Beane is the general manager. And the plot of the movie is he has to restaff his Major League Baseball team that has been gutted. They had a great season, and they did so well that the major market teams gutted them, took their best players. And so he's in a rebuilding year. And in his rebuilding year, he looks to his scouts and he asks his scouts, who are we going to bring back to the team? What's that new talent? And instead of adopting the reality of where they were, which is a small market baseball team, they thought of themselves as big market baseball teams in the same equation. Well, we have to go out and we have to get good looking baseball players that have a good swing and a good throwing arm. And they weren't looking at it right. And what Billy Beane challenged him is, you're not asking the right question. How are we going to win? And it's by getting on base. And I think there's a little bit of truth for us in this conversation. It's not about how we ran our business 10, 15, 20 years ago. And God, I can't wait until we can do that again. It is, what do we need to do to get on base? How do we need to think about staffing our teams differently for success? And that's what gets me really excited, is that how can we use, in the movie's case, and it holds true to my case that I'm talking about, is data is a big part. Billy Beane's assistant said, we need to find players that get on base. We need to find people that know how to create value in different ways. And that's what I think we've been talking about here today. And I think that is the opportunity conversation that's out in front of us. I don't have perfect insight into what those questions are, but it has to revolve around, how can people count on us to deliver energy that's going to be reliable? How can we drive affordability around energy and making sure that it's as economic as we possibly can make it? And then how are we going to continue to decarbonize such that opposition and ourselves can sit down at a table and really settle into having hard, real conversations that produces meaningful outcome. And in my opinion, the most meaningful outcome is going to be the ability for our country to install interstate natural gas pipelines that can move a very abundant sources of natural gas supply to markets that are demanding more and more natural gas. We think about artificial intelligence and the associated data centers. We think about the LNG space that's developing across the country, especially in the Gulf Coast. We think about onshoring industrial activity. We think about the continued adoption of electric vehicles. And we're going to run headlong into a shortage of electrons if we don't begin to ask ourselves the right questions and sit down and have meaningful conversation around what is limiting us from being able to provide electricity for all those needs and demands.
Okay, my brain is exploding with like 5,000 things I want to follow up on. So bear with me, Scott, while I pull on them. First, great way to talk about the lifeblood of our economy by putting numbers of miles on our beloved natural gas infrastructure. I love that. Like my map of the economies, blood flow just had a lot of numbers on it. I love that. And then second, I think you're providing a different way of thinking about the moment. That's about, you can only go forward, right? You can't go backward. There is no version of going back. So it's sort of just a primary point of entry test is like, are we asking questions that take us forward or asking questions that are backward looking? And so I'm going to give that a little more thought. I think that's very central to what you're saying. But also that's true of any leader, like any leader who's not relentlessly embracing disruption is probably not going to be successful. And disruption is just another way of saying the future, which I think is what you're saying. But here's the thing I really want to pull on, which is, okay, first of all, I love Moneyball, like nerd alert again. And we'll put a link in the show notes to Moneyball. And I'd say even go straight for the book so you can really nerd out on it. But the movie is excellent. But so the thing with Moneyball is that they looked at something where people were doing a bunch of sort of soft, emotional, reactive things, which is a lot. We think we're doing data things in the industry, but we are kind of having, in some ways, a political reaction or, like an identity reaction. And you're saying, like, let's ask the right questions. Like, let's ask what's really happening here. And so I just want to spend a minute thinking about that sort of like emotional stuff versus data stuff. Because I think if I make an error in my work, it's talking too much about the emotional stuff. Like, hey, we're alienating our audience. We need to have a vision. We need to be more leery. But you're really talking about sort of data. So how do you square those two things, like the emotional side of this and the like data side of this, to make sure we are asking the right questions?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have a perfect answer other than I think we have to identify what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And I think many times when I've had an opportunity to discuss, all things energy with somebody that doesn't see the world quite like me, I find that I struggle with us not talking past each other, almost like we're playing a different game or having a different conversation. We're trying to solve different problems. And I mean, for us, we know that demand is so high that there isn't this sense of there's a winner and a loser. There is no winner and loser here. We have to find a way to work together to ensure that we have the right outcome. I've lived through Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott. I was a consumer for both, and I was an operator for both. And what I experienced is, as a consumer, I didn't have electricity when it was extremely cold here in Houston. And I also didn't have electricity where I was in South Carolina during Winter Storm Elliott. And I know that's not an acceptable outcome. It wasn't for me as a consumer. And I know as an operator, those aren't acceptable outcomes. And so trying to solve for that rather than necessarily getting caught up in the idealism of one way or the other. The idealism that it has to be natural gas or it has to be something on the thermal generation side, or the idealism and of it has to be a weather generation, weather dependent resource, or it has to be hydrogen or CO2. It has to be all of the above. We have to be tempered in what is possible, and we have to work through the challenges of, can we put hydrogen in a carbon-based pipeline system? Maybe not. We have to be smart about those things, and we're working through those things. Is CO2 or carbon sequestration, is that a legitimate control technique for electric generation? I think we have to really challenge whether or not it is. And I think it really tests from a reliability and an affordability standpoint, whether those are techniques that we should. Should we say no? Heck no. We need to explore, we need to look. And I think there's a place for all of us in those conversations. So it's not getting caught up in idealism. It's not getting caught up in oversimplifying the problem. My last point on this, and I come from an industry that is very esoteric. Every pipeline has its own kind of rules of the road. We have our own nomenclature, wording that describes what you can and can't do. We call them tariffs. If you're not in it, you don't really understand what it all means. And if you are in it, if you're not working with every pipeline, you don't understand necessarily what each other is really talking about. And that's where I think we as an industry need to continue to look for ways to help simplify what we're doing, because I think that complexity challenges the understanding that people have of what we do. And so we need to find ways to continue to find middle ground and explain what we do, but also simplify what we do as well.
That was really helpful, because what you're helping me understand in terms of the takeaways from Moneyball, still love it, isn't that it's about getting to the data, like get to the right data, which is important. And maybe it's different data than you've been thinking about. But what you're really saying is there a different way of thinking about this? Is there a different way of looking at this? And the way I'm hearing it, and I want to get your reaction to this, is as an industry, we want to ask ourselves these questions. Is there a different way of thinking about this? Is there a different way of looking at these problems than maybe we are today? But also in the moment, the way we step into the moment, and this is a novel idea, so I I hold the right to take it back if I don't like it after I say it. But as we step in as civic leaders, as partners to policymakers, can we also create a space with them to say, hey, are we collectively as a society asking the right questions? Are we collectively thinking about this with the widest possible aperture? That's a very interesting idea, Scott, because it's less about like, let me share your aspiration and help you get there. It's more like, let me be your thought partner. Let me be your solution partner. And then when you realize that maybe the old constraints were the wrong ones, you have a lot higher buy-in if they were along for the ride on, are we asking the right questions?
Maybe that we have more in common than we actually think. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes, as I was kind of walking through the, regional transmission operators and utility commissions and utilities, at times it feels like we're all kind of battling and we don't really understand what each other's doing. But when you take a moment and you understand what's important to a regional transmission operator, you find out there's a lot in common there. Even though for me, I'm a natural gas guy working in the natural gas space, I have no issues with more electrification because we know that we're a main lifeblood for electric generation and most reliable. Mm-hmm. If I could pivot, but slightly too, one of the things that keeps me up in terms of, the challenge of articulating our case and what's important is over the last several years has been a heavy focus on what I call demand pull projects. Mm-hmm. And that's where an operator like me would go to the FERC and we would have agreements with downstream customers that we're able to pull that gas supply to points of demand. And it's really, it's been probably the most functional of a semi-functional work process over the last several years. What's starting to keep me up at night, though, is our country is blessed with an abundant amount of natural gas. But we are beginning to starve ourselves of the ability to access that supply. We're creating somewhat the artery system to move it from areas of aggregation or liquidity to end use markets, and we could be doing a lot better. But I would say we are starting to see a shortage of the ability to move that abundant supply to those points where the infrastructure can take it to the demand markets. And there's been a perception that there isn't a public need for that gas supply or the supply push project because it doesn't have the same attributes as a demand pull project because the customers aren't utilities, they're producers. And I think what we're going to begin to see over time is that the utility customers aren't going to have access to that same level of liquidity, natural gas supply, because we've starved them off without having supply push projects. And so that's an area where I think we have to be invested in talking through projects that really have felt untouchable over the last several years, because if we don't, we're going to wake up one day and there isn't going to be enough gas to feed all of the power plants that are hanging off of these interstate natural gas pipeline systems and LDCs. And my last point is this. When you look at how a electric generator operates, they don't operate in a smooth laminar flow. They're up and down based on the demands of their markets. And that's where we need more supply, always ready to meet that up demand. And so it's really important that we're thinking through the full supply and demand dynamics, which is very data driven when it comes to our industry. So that's definitely an area where I'm looking forward to having meaningful conversation.
That's a really interesting point on multiple levels, because the superficial climate conversation just shuts that conversation down, right? Like fossil fuels, X, but a more nuanced shared objectives, increase supply, more flexibility, more redundancy, more pathways, that starts making room for conversation about supply and pipes and storage, all the things we're going to need, especially if you have a natural gas system. You want to be able to to run just like peaking only or something, then you need even more capacity, more redundancy. And these are just the complexities of the system that we haven't been able to have conversations around. So I think you're absolutely right. And I'll be thinking about, and we'll be continuing to have our conversations about, like, what are the way we engage with policymakers where they're willing to come to the table and they don't feel like it's a betrayal of a climate agenda. And I think that's where it's been forbidden, or, it's been off the table, and your reframe makes room for it. It makes room for these kind of conversations.
I appreciate it. And I think affordability is going to be a big part of it, because what I do think will happen is we'll always have the gas getting through the system to the end markets. It's going to be highly volatile pricing around that gas, because the people that'll pay the most are the ones that are actually going to be able to get it.
Mm.
And so I don't think it's going to be a matter of, I can't get gas to this town or to this utility. It's going to be a matter of it's extremely expensive. And it doesn't have to be that way if the artery system was adequately plumbed for all of this abundant supply to get to those end use markets.
That makes a lot of sense. So let me ask you, in this context of, I sort of alluded to the oversimplified conversation, which is happening in this very polarized political environment, right? Where people kind of take sides. Their feelings about climate and energy sort of align with their political identity, to oversimplify. As a leader of a company, I imagine, just the way you're framing your discussion, you strive to transcend or avoid those kind of that kind of polarization. How do you think about that? How do you navigate that as a leader who wants to be successful in transforming?
I think it boils down to a few things, and it really puts into focus what is your vision, your mission, and your values. Here at Boardwalk, we believe that our place in our long-term vision is that we want to be constructive in maintaining America's energy advantage. And I think when we are able to do that, and when America can maintain its energy advantage, it has a benefit for the globe. It brings emissions reductions across the globe. It elevates people out of poverty across the globe. It creates more affordability for energy across the globe. So we see that as it's really helping the entire world, but we're very focused here in the United States. Our values, that, we want to be safe. That is our core number one value. And I'm sure any guest in the energy space would say the same thing. We believe in it passionately. We want to be reliable. And like I talked about earlier, when I started in the energy space, really gas was something that was really only used in the winter, maybe the late fall, early spring. And as an operator, you would have the rest of the year to work on maintenance, perform inline inspections, make sure the pipelines are safe. You fast forward to today, and our assets are being used 8,760 hours a year. That is 365 days. So we have to be very planned out and deliberate around how we're maintaining the safety and reliability of our pipeline. So you can't take it for granted. It is a value of ours, not quite like safety, but it is really darn close. And part of that is being embracing being innovative. How do we bring technology into our business? How do we have good governance around our data? It's all kind of all the above when it comes to an energy company like Boardwalk, where we want our workforce it's really where the best ideas reside, that all of them can bubble up and be part of, creating value for the business. And many times, and I've learned it many times over, that it's the employees that are doing the work, that are as close to the work as possible, that have the best ideas on how we can do it better. Recompression, it's a tool that we use as an industry extensively today that we weren't doing 5 years ago. It's where you're able to move gas from one segment of pipe to another segment of pipe without blowing it to atmosphere, which was our industry standard 10 years ago. And that was an approach that was discovered by frontline employees, where they were able to bring that gas and ensure that we're not putting it into atmosphere. So it's ideas like that. I think that, can move the focus away from the polarization and towards how can we be successful? How can we drive value? And how can the whole organization contribute to the bottom line? Because at the end of the day, that's what everybody wants. They want to feel like they're contributing to the business, not being a cost to the business, but being a value addition to the business.
Well, there's something about the way you're approaching this, Scott, that keeps making me forget this is polarized. so I think you're on the right track, because I live in this polarized world, and as we talk, I get caught up in, yeah, of course, we're all swimming in the same direction, toward the future. So I really like the way you're setting up your thinking, and we won't hold you accountable, just like we won't hold me accountable. You don't have to stay exactly where you started in this conversation, because this is evolving space and we're evolving our thinking about it. So I have a final question for you, the one I like to ask all my guests, which is, in any arena, what are you most optimistic about?
Well, I probably sound like a broken record, but what I'm most optimistic about is that every aspect of our business can drive value in the energy space today. There's nobody at Boardwalk that should feel like they're not driving our bottom line results. And I would have to believe, if you asked anybody in any energy company, they feel the same way, or at least they should, that today, for us to be competitive and bringing our full capabilities to the market, we are driving results. And I think that gives me energy. I think that gives anybody energy when they know that they're driving bottom line results to a business and making them successful. That's why we show up every day, is to make what we're around us better. And so I'm optimistic that, as we go another 5 years, we're going to continue to find more ways to create value that we're not acknowledging or noticing today. And I know that that's going to bring more people in our corporations together and driving those results. So I look forward to how we can use data, how we can use things like artificial intelligence with the right governance in place to more effectively use our resources. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be doing over the next 5 years.
Well, Scott, keep thinking about things differently, because I want more thoughts from you in the months ahead on the questions we should be asking as civic leaders, as industry leaders. And I would like to see where we go with depolarizing these conversations by being future oriented. So thank you so much, Scott, for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Thanks, Tisha. I had a great time today.
That's our episode for today. You've been listening to Energy Thinks. I would like to thank Scott Hallam for joining me and sharing his insights. I really enjoyed a lot of the theme that was woven through about how the industry can't stand still, and we can't stand still. That being relentlessly future focused is really the antidote for a lot of the controversy around these topics. And I really enjoyed that. I'd like to thank you, our listeners, for giving me a reason to talk to so many interesting people. If you enjoy what you're hearing, it would be amazing if you could take a second and rate this podcast. It will help other people find us. If you'd like to know more about our work at Adamantine, please check out energythinks.com. And while you're there, please subscribe to my weekly email. Both of these things are true. I'd like to thank my colleague, Kayla Chives, for making the Energy Thinks podcast possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.